urge that there should be some urgency to this reform of the House.
Well, let me respond to the Right Honourable and Learned Lady and to the Honourable Lady. In the first instance, I think it worthwhile to be candid in saying that I am advised, and of course I seek advice and must then hear what the advice is, that it is not within the gifts of party authorities, though I would argue they are in a sense House authorities, to facilitate proxy voting for tomorrow. I respect that view, though in all candour I'm not sure that I agree with it. But it is tendered to me in good faith, and I put it out there for the House to know. I believe that it is absolutely essential, not just in terms of the rights of the honourable member, but for the reputation of this House as an institution approaching or starting to take an interest in the modern world, that the honourable member for Hampstead and Kilburn should be facilitated tomorrow to vote. The notion that she should have to be wheeled through a division lobby, I think would be regarded as very large numbers of people as completely uncivilised. That should not have to happen. It has been suggested to me that in a departure from, or at any rate an extension of, the normal nodding through arrangement that exists, which ordinarily applies to somebody who is indisposed but on the parliamentary estate, the Honourable Lady could be nodded through so that her vote would count, even if she were in fact in a hospital bed at the time. I do not rule out that possibility, and for my part I would be happy on my own shoulders to agree to that. Personally, I think it preferable that the Honourable Lady should have a proxy vote, but that does seem to me to depend upon cross-party agreement. I have been approached about this matter by the chair of the all-party group on women in the House, the Honourable Lady, the member for Chelmsford, who wrote to me very recently. And it's good to see the Honourable Lady, the member for Chelmsford, is in her place. Forgive me, I hadn't seen her, and if she wants to come in on this exchange very properly, she can, not if she doesn't wish to do so. I wrote back to the Honourable Lady, the member for Chelmsford, making it explicitly clear that I have, from this chair, made clear my own support for and willingness to assist in the introduction of proxy voting for purposes of baby leave. I have done that several times. I think it is important for the House to know, and for those attending our proceedings to be told of the facts of this matter. This matter has been debated in the Chamber twice. First, on the 1st of February last year, in a debate under the auspices of the Backbench Business Committee, if memory serves me, a debate secured at the instigation of the Right Honourable and Learned Lady, the member for Camberwell and Peckham. Now, on that occasion, the proposition that proxy voting for baby leave should be introduced was passed, if I'm right, nem con, that is to say, without opposition. Subsequently, there was a debate in this chamber on the 13th of September last year, in government time, what is called a general debate. There was no division of the House, and so there is no recorded vote, but my recollection on that occasion is that there was strong support for the change. The Leader of the House, who I think was present at the time, indicated her desire to expedite progress on this matter, and I understand from my own contacts it to have been very much her wish to be able to bring about change before the end of last year. I think, if I may say so, and I will, it is extremely regrettable that almost a year after the first debate, and over 4 months after the second debate, this change has not been made. This is frankly lamentable. Lamentable. Lamentable and very disadvantageous and injurious to the reputation of this House. So if there is agreement that can be reached between the usual channels today, and I'm chairing in the chamber, so members will need to come and tell me what has been agreed, I myself am very happy to facilitate a change for tomorrow, preferably in the form of a proxy vote for the Honourable Lady, but at the very least ensuring that she can be nodded through. It really is time, in pursuit of the express will of this House, that reactionary forces are overcome. And if people want to express their opposition, let them not do it murkily behind the scenes. Let them have the character to say up front that they oppose progressive change. And I hope that we can get progressive change, and what better opportunity to do so than before our historic vote tomorrow. I hope I have made my own views clear. Well, that partly deals with that, and I'm now in the hands of, well, if I may say so, I say for the benefit of our observers, a very formidable band of colleagues. They will help make it happen. Point of order, Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Literally just follows on to that. While I utterly support the idea of proxy voting for women such as our colleague, we have people who are absent from the Chamber and the Parliament for a varying range of illnesses, or partners, family members who are terminally ill. This is actually something that needs dealt with across the range.
That may very well be so, and I'm not unsympathetic to the Honourable Lady's proposition, but I was speaking pretty much off the top of my head, and what I didn't say, but should have said, because it's part of the pattern and the picture, is that the Procedure Committee was invited to consider this matter. I gave evidence to it, as I know other members did, and the Procedure Committee specifically endorsed the idea and was looking for a resolution to be put to the House. Ordinarily, such a resolution would be put to the House by the Leader of the House. I very much regret that that has not happened, but pragmatically I am seeking, on the back of discussions with the Right Honourable and Learned Lady, to broker progress, not next month or next year or at some unspecified point in the distant future, but with effect from tomorrow. That wider issue of other categories can and should, of course, properly be considered by the House of Commons. Order. We come now to the urgent question. Margaret Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 6th of January, it was reported in the Observer that the government had...
The Honourable Lady is always ahead of herself. Now, what she does at this stage is just say to ask the Minister for a statement on. We'll get her full blast in a moment. Margaret Greenwood.
Speaker, will she make a statement on universal credit?
Thank you. Minister Alok Sharma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I outlined in the written statement tabled last Friday in the House, we have decided to replace the current regulations relating to managed migration previously laid before the House with two new sets of regulations. These will allow a series of measures relating to universal credit to be put in place. The Government will seek powers in an affirmative set of regulations for a pilot of managed migration, so the Department cannot issue any more migration notices once 10,000 people have been awarded universal credit throughout the process. These regulations will also deliver our commitment to provide transitional protection for those managed migrated to universal credit. Separate regulations will put in place a severe disability premium gateway, allowing recipients of this benefit to continue to claim existing benefits until they are managed migrated onto universal credit. In addition, my statement reported that we are bringing forward the necessary legislation to remove the planned extension of the policy to provide support for a maximum of 2 children in universal credit. This overall policy ensures that parents receiving benefits face the same financial decisions about the size of their family as those supporting themselves solely through work. However, we decided that it would not be right to apply this policy to children born before it came into law on the 6th of April 2017, and so we have cancelled this extension. Mr. Speaker, the benefits freeze up to April 2020 was voted for by Parliament as part of the Welfare Reform and Work Act 2016. As a general point, any changes relating to benefit uprating will be brought before Parliament in the usual way.
Margaret Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On the 6th of January, it was reported in the Observer that the Government had decided to ask for powers from Parliament for a pilot to manage migration of 10,000 people from legacy benefits to universal credit, rather than for a managed migration as a whole. However, on the 7th of January, at oral questions, and the following day, in response to an urgent questions, ministers failed to provide clarification on the Government's plans. Then on Thursday, the Secretary of State told Sky News she didn't expect the social security freeze to be renewed when it came to an end in April 2020. And on Friday, the 11th of January, the Secretary of State made a wide-ranging speech on social security about her intentions in relation to managed migration, private sector rents, childcare costs and the two-child limit. But she did not make it in this House, nor did she give members the opportunity to ask questions about these really important matters. On the same day, the High Court found in favour of 4 single mothers who had brought a legal challenge against the Government on the grounds that universal credit failed to take into account their fluctuating income when they were paid twice in a month because their payday fell very near the end of the month. So can the Minister tell the House, how does the Government intend to respond to the High Court judgment? Does he think the two-child limit is fair for the children affected by it, and will the Government not scrap the two-child limit altogether? Will the Government address the key concern with managed migration that nobody's claim for benefits that they are currently receiving will be ended until they have made a successful new claim for universal credit? Will the Government make sure that the levels set for payments to people in receipt of severe disability premium who have already transferred to universal credit reflect the financial loss that they have suffered? Will the Government take immediate action to ensure no one has to wait 5 weeks to receive their initial payment for universal credit? Why is the benefits freeze not going to be cancelled now rather than waiting until April 2020, as she says she believes that the reasons for it being introduced no longer apply? And finally, will this Government call a halt to the rollout of universal credit?
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the Honourable Lady for her comments. Could I just say that very many people outside this House, many stakeholders, have welcomed the statements that were made in this House on Friday, and of course what the Secretary of State said in her speech. And I'm sorry she welcomed the positive changes that have been made and are being proposed. She talked about a number of issues, and let me just go through them, Mr Speaker. She talked about the legal judgment on Friday. As she herself has acknowledged, that judgment came out literally a few days ago. As the Department, we will consider it very carefully and then respond. In terms of the two-child policy, of course, we have made that change, and the regulations were laid on Friday, as she will be aware. But she talks about the overall two-child policy, and we do believe that the overall policy is fair. Ultimately, those who are receiving support in the welfare system should be facing the same sort of choices that those who support themselves solely through work do. And it's worth pointing out that for a family that supports themselves solely through work, if they decide to have another child, they wouldn't automatically expect their wages to go up. This is about sustainability. She talked about the pilot. We've made it very clear that this will start in July 2019. We're working with a very long range of stakeholders on this. We talked about the severe disability premium. Of course, those regulations have been laid. And she talked about the benefit freeze. Could I just ask her to reflect, Mr. Speaker, the reason that we have had to make various policy choices in the past? And that is because the absolutely awful financial mess left to us by the last Labour government. I'm sorry, she can't get away from that point. And the final thing I would say to her, she talks about, Mr. Speaker, changes to the 5-week period. What I would just say to her is that if she is so keen, and I've said it in this House before, if she's so keen on supporting claimants, and particularly the vulnerable, which we on this side are, why did she not support the £1.5 billion of support that came in Budget 2017 and the £4.5 billion of support announced in the 2018 budget?
Order. On account of the fact that we have a Prime Ministerial statement to follow and then 8 hours of protected time for the debate on the withdrawal agreement, I am looking to conclude these exchanges by 4:15, and I'm sure colleagues will want to factor that into their calculations. Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, can I firstly congratulate my right honourable Minister and his Secretary of State on the progress they're making in eliminating some of the obvious defects that have emerged in this otherwise highly desirable policy. Does he agree with me that the problem is the details were designed by people who were well-intentioned but too paternalistic in their attempts to introduce people to the disciplines and normal way of life of people in work, when they were dealing with people often who were very vulnerable and relying day to day on cash? So when it is affordable, after we've really recovered from the consequences of the financial disaster, will he address the 5-week delay in the first payment, which just caused hardship and I hope is gone by the time that the so-called migration comes to my constituency?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for his support for the policies that we have announced. I just say to him that in terms of the 5-week period, we of course have ensured that people can get support from day one if they're required in terms of 100% advances. There's 2 weeks of housing benefit run-on that's available as well, and as part of the package we announced in the budget there is additional run-on support available that will come in from 2020. But of course he's right, we need to make sure that throughout this process we support the most vulnerable, and that's exactly what the changes that have been announced have been all about.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First I would like to say how inappropriate it is that the Secretary of State made this statement on Friday outside the House and hasn't even bothered to come here today, Mr. Speaker, to speak for herself. We in the SNP welcome this U-turn from the Secretary of State, which vindicates what we, along with a range of charities, women's organisations and faith groups, have been saying since the July budget in 2015. However, none of us will be fully satisfied while the two-child limit applies for births after the 6th of April 2017. It must be scrapped now. The Secretary of State has accepted already that the fundamental unfairness of the two-child limit. So why does he feel this policy, with its cruel and pernicious rape clause, with this form, Mr. Speaker, must continue even though it has been ruled unfair for other people? Does he not see that this creates a two-tier system in universal credit depending on when children were born? Mr. Speaker, we cannot plan for everything in our life. Has he heard the evidence from Turn to Us and CPAG that the two-child policy is forcing women into terminating healthy pregnancies? Has he heard of the discrimination from religious and ethnic minorities? Does he know that most people claiming this benefit are actually in work? In its first year of operation, it affected 73,530 people. So where does the figure of 15,000 come from, Mr. Speaker? Friday's court ruling laid bare the flaws in universal credit, which many in this House have been highlighting around the payment and the timings of payments. High Court judges said that the DWP had wrongly interpreted the relevant regulations and tried to justify this shamefully on the grounds of cost. What steps will he take to put this right? And will he stop wasting money in the courts rather than ensuring our constituents get what they are fully entitled to? And lastly, Mr. Speaker, in its final year alone, the benefit freeze will cut £4.7 billion from the welfare budget, more than the money that the Chancellor pledged for the work allowance for the next 4 years. Will he make the case to the Chancellor to scrap the freeze, which is making life so hard for so many of our constituents?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful that the Honourable Lady has welcomed the changes that have been announced. For that I am indeed grateful. She refers to the Secretary of State. She will be aware that the statement in terms of the changes was made in my name. The regulations have been laid in my name, and that is absolutely appropriate that I come here and quite rightly answer questions that colleagues have. She talked about the non-consensual conception clause, and of course I absolutely agree with her that women who find themselves in these utterly awful circumstances need to get the help that they need, and this has to be done in the most compassionate way. And we have had a discussion on this point previously. What I would say to her, she's aware it is purely a question of whether the circumstances that are described are consistent with someone who has met the criteria for this exception. And it is, of course, the individuals that are dealing with this are third-party professionals who already have experience in supporting vulnerable women. And the final point, in terms of the court judgment on Friday, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, we will consider that and respond.
John Redwood.
I welcome the emphasis on helping people into work and the idea that we should have compassionate implementation. With that in mind, are there going to be changes on earlier timing of benefit for those first in need of it? And is there going to be some review of the housing element, which has sometimes also caused trouble?
Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for his question. Of course, he's right. Throughout this process, we have to provide support, particularly for the vulnerable. And as he will know, once universal credit is fully rolled out, there will be over an extra £2 billion in the welfare system than under the current legacy benefits. But of course, we have to help the vulnerable. And one of the changes that was made in the budget was the uplifting of work allowances, which will be helping young parents with children, and of course, also the disabled.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Any improvements of this hideous programme are welcome, but there are still going to be thousands of UC claimants that are moved on to universal credit this year as a result of natural migration with no transitional protections. So how many people will be pushed into poverty as a result of this move and of the lack of compassion by this government in unfreezing the benefit system?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said previously in this House, and I said it earlier this afternoon, is that we have put more money into the system to support the most vulnerable. And that's absolutely right, and that is why we have done it. And as far as the pilot phase is concerned, of course, we will work very carefully with stakeholders to make sure we get this right.
Sir Nicholas Soames.
May I warmly welcome this excellent move by his department. And would he please pay tribute to the sympathetic, careful, diligent and effective manner in which the staff of the Job Centre Plus in Haywards Heath carry out their difficult duties?
My right honourable friend highlights a really important point, and he talks about the incredibly hard-working DWP staff in Haywards Heath Job Centre. But of course, I see this, the Secretary sees this, as we go up and down the country talking to our colleagues in job centres. They are all incredibly committed, and they do see the benefits of universal credit in helping people and making sure they provide that one-to-one support to claimants, which wasn't in place previously.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also welcome these modest steps in the right direction, but why did the Secretary of State and the Minister both deny a week ago the change which he's now announced about the separate regulations for the 10,000 migration? Will he respond to the point made by the Father of the House? The 5-week delay is indefensible. It is forcing people to rely on advances, putting them into debt right at the start of their claim.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know we've had this exchange before, and I'm sorry if he feels that I repeat myself, but of course it's important that we get money in people's pocket early. There's no question about that, and that is why we made the changes when we said that we would make sure that absolutely anyone who needed it could get up to 100% of their advances up front. I've talked about the 2-week run-on of those on housing benefit, which doesn't have to be repaid. And as he knows, also in the budget that's just been, we've also announced that from July 2020, those on out-of-work DWP benefits will also get a 2-week run-on.
Of the Job Centre Plus in Redditch said this is the best system she's seen in 30 years. She's been at the front line, Mr. Speaker. And does the Minister agree with me that today the Resolution Foundation have pointed out to the fact that it's those people at the lowest end of the income spectrum who are actually getting back into work? This is a truly progressive benefit, and it's great to see these reforms.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend highlights a very important point. I, in fact, was at the launch of the Resolution Foundation's report this morning, which highlighted precisely the point she's raised. And I would just say that I would encourage all colleagues, obviously on the government side, but also on the opposition side, to actually go to their job centres, visit, and talk. No, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, if they would talk directly to the people responsible for providing that advice, I think they would find that the system is working.
Angela Regal.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister should not patronise the opposition by pretending that somehow we don't all do our constituency duty and we haven't been to visit our local job centres. I can assure him we have. And the problem with this benefit is that it was introduced to save money. Large cuts in welfare systems and payments were made. He's put a little bit back, which has got to be welcome, but he's not put back what was taken away. And what was taken away is leaving my constituents relying on food bank with not enough to eat. And he needs to recognise that reality.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, could I suggest that perhaps this week, if she has time, she and I talk directly with the colleagues in the job centre in her area, and let's have a discussion with them. Let's have a discussion with them and see how we can support her constituents even better.
You Merriman.
Mr. Speaker, surely everybody in this place will want to help people on benefits, but ultimately transfer them so they have the opportunity to work and then pay more into the essential public services that they, and indeed we all, need to get by. Given we have record numbers of employment, record unemployment, surely this policy must be doing something right to those ends.
Mr. Speaker, the policies we've been put in place since 2010 are working. You can see that in the jobs figures. And I would just point out that when we came into power in 2010, 1.4 million people in the country had been on out-of-work benefits for at least 9 of the previous 10 years. That is not a legacy that the opposition should be proud of.
George.
Thank you very much. And yes, universal credit does help Job Centre Plus workers who are trying to persuade people to go into short-hour jobs and zero-hour contracts where their hours of work fluctuate. We welcome very small changes to this which will help a few thousand people. What will the government be doing to help the thousands on universal credit who were paid a few days early over the Christmas period and then received absolutely nothing for their December-January payment of universal credit and are now suffering arrears of rent and childcare payments because of that which the High Court have just ruled against?
Mr. Speaker, we will of course respond on the High Court ruling, but I would just point out to her, and I'm pleased she raised this point about what sort of jobs have been created. Just to put it on the record, and these aren't government figures, this is from the Office for National Statistics, since 2010, of all the jobs that have been created, 75% are full-time, they are in high-level occupations, and they're permanent. That is something that I wish colleagues opposite would acknowledge.
Nigel Mills.
And the Minister on these announcements, especially the one on the two-child limit, where he appears to have accepted the recommendations of the Select Committee within hours of it actually making them. So perhaps on that theme, he may have missed some previous recommendations if he's looking for ideas. One of those is that for the managed migration he's now trialling, will he look at actually moving people on existing benefits over rather than asking them to make their own new claim? That would seem to me to be a far more effective system and far better for those claimants.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that he feels we were able to react in a matter of hours to the recommendations of the Select Committee. What I think he's talking about is a process of actually sort of pre-population. What I would say to him is that we will, of course, work throughout the pilot phase, and we've responded to the Social Security Advisory Committee with some of the plans that we have. But I would just point out to him that when we had the move to ESA, as a result of having incomplete information, we underpaid people.
Neil Coyle.
I welcome the Minister's commitment to reopening the Wallasey Job Centre in order to meet the commitment he's just made, my honourable friend. But it's 5 years since the government began to impose universal credit. Doesn't this latest change underline it's failed its three aims? It's overdue, over budget and overly complex. And shouldn't all rollout be halted until all the fundamental flaws are fixed?
Mr. Speaker, universal credit has rolled out across the country now, as you will be aware, and we, of course, will continue to proceed with it. He's right. We need to get this right for everyone, and that is precisely what the changes are about. But universal credit does work for the majority, the vast majority of people who claim it, but it's absolutely right that we provide that support, particularly for the most vulnerable.
Mr. Philip
Confirmed that when fully rolled out, spending on universal credit will be some £2 billion a year more than on the existing legacy benefits, and this could be worth on average up to £300 per universal credit family.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right. There will be more money in the system. And I should point out that under the legacy benefit system, there is £2.4 billion of unclaimed benefits. That will change under universal credit, supporting an estimated 700,000 households who will get paid their full entitlement under universal credit.
Chris Stevens.
Of course, many opposition members take representations from trade unions, the voice of the DWP workforce, which often falls on deaf ears on the government side. But isn't the reality that the final year of the benefit freeze undermines absolutely any changes ministers are trying to make to the benefit system? So can he tell us what representations he and his department are making to the Treasury to scrap the final year of the benefit freeze?
Mr. Speaker, the reason, and I'm not going to apologise for repeating this, the reason that we made so many difficult decisions when we first came into office and in the subsequent years is because of the record deficit we were left by the opposition. And there is no getting away from it. I've already made it clear, Mr. Speaker, that when it comes to issues around uprating, these will be announced in the appropriate way to Parliament.
Mr Campbell, it's very early in the week. I can't put it down to the effects of hot curry because I doubt you've consumed that thus far. But there are several days to go and you need to remain calm. You're a very great figure in the House, but I'm concerned for your well-being. Mrs Helen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We've been warning ministers about this problem of the dates for months. So will he now rule out... What's the word? No. Appealing the court decision.
Mr. Speaker, let me just repeat once more. That judgment that she refers to came out on Friday. We are going to have to consider it very carefully, and we will respond in due course.
Nigel Huddleston. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I applaud the Government for listening and for making essential changes based on evidence brought by both sides of the Chamber of the House of Commons? Can the Minister assure me that if further evidence comes to light requiring further changes, that the Government will continue to listen and make changes as necessary?
Mr Speaker, I hope what we have shown over the past couple of years is that we do listen and we do make changes, and of course, where it's appropriate, we will continue to do so.
Mr Speaker, sometimes it can be hard to understand what the Minister is really saying to us, because most people call non-consensual conception rape, Mr Speaker. That's what we're talking about. And most people in this country would think picking and choosing between the children we choose to support, most people would call that discrimination, Mr Speaker. So can I ask the Minister, the next time he has to come to this House, as he undoubtedly will, to tell us about a policy change in relation to the two-child policy, will he commit to telling us exactly what the characteristics are of the kids that our government will no longer support?
Well, I'm sorry, Mr Speaker, that the Honourable Lady has not felt able to welcome the changes that we've made. And we have, through the last two budgets, announced additional support. As I've just answered a question to my honourable friend, of course, where appropriate, we will see what more we can do.
Universal credit was rolled out in Thirsk-and-Motton almost 2 years ago, largely successfully, but there are issues with it, particularly with regard to payment frequency. Would my honourable friend commit to continue to listen and to learn and to make adaptations where necessary?
Mr Speaker, my honourable friend raises a very important point, because a number of the other issues that were announced by the Secretary of State relate, of course, to looking at more frequent direct payments to private landlords, and also looking at having alternative payment arrangements and proactively offering these.
Owen Smith. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I do welcome the fact that the Minister is going to disapply this policy for 15,000 children and families, but could he confirm that it is still prospectively going to take more than £2,500 away from 640,000 families in this country? And could he tell me what is fair or compassionate about that?
Mr Speaker, in terms of this policy, He's right, it'll affect 15,000, support 15,000 families, but we anticipate that over a 5-year period there'll be 77,000 families and 113,000 children who will benefit from this, and it's important that we provide this support. But ultimately, as he will know, that this policy was also tested, the overall policy was tested in the courts and was found to be sound.
Joanna Cherry.
Universal credit is now being rolled out in my constituency and across the city of Edinburgh, and I've been meeting with those who specialise in advising my constituents about problems they encounter in the benefit system, such as the Community Help and Advice Association. They want to know why the government is not addressing all the flaws and halting the rollout until all the serious flaws are properly addressed.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Honourable Lady will find that universal credit has already rolled out in her local area. The last rollouts were in December. What I would just say to her that in terms of providing support, she will be aware of the partnership we now have with Citizens Advice, which will make a difference to help particularly the most vulnerable.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker. Minister, I welcome the changes that you have put forward, but however, universal credit has been brought into my constituency, and Minister, it has created incredible problems, delays, reduction of payments. So could the Minister outline what will be done to assist those who are already in the universal credit bubble and system and not in the pilot scheme?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he and I have had a discussion around universal credit previously, and as I've always said to him, my door is open. If he has specific cases, we're very happy to review those.
Rashanara Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over 100 MPs supported the campaign to scrap the two-child limit policy, which is a campaign supported across parties, including by the Honourable Member for Glasgow Central. Some 3 million children will still be affected by the policy, even though the government has decided to relax it somewhat. Can I ask the Minister to heed that advice from MPs and scrap the policy altogether?
Mr. Speaker, we have listened, and as she will know that I came and spoke to her and other colleagues about this policy in November. We have made the change in terms of retrospective nature, but I would just point out that this overall policy is about fairness, both to those who receive welfare benefits, but also, of course, to taxpayers.
Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This government has finally recognised the risks to women and children of giving universal credit to just one member of a household. So will the Minister now explain how DWP will identify the main caregiver in a household and what other steps will be taken to protect women and children from domestic abuse?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would just point out that payments to a single person in a household is not a unique feature in universal credit. It also exists in the legacy benefit system. But she's right. Right now, 60% of all universal credit payments go to the female's bank account. And what the Secretary of State has announced is that we will look to see what more we can do to enable the main carer to receive universal credit. Very often that will be the female in the household.
Anna Johnson.
Speaker, we've only been back 7 days, and this is now the second urgent question on universal credit. So isn't it now time for the Secretary of State to come to this House and make a government statement about what she intends to do about the mess of universal credit?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry the Honourable Lady is so unhappy. I would have thought she should be welcoming all the positive changes that we've been making. And indeed, the Secretary of State was before the House just last week in DWP orals answering questions on universal credit and other policy.
Sir Mark Hendrick.
Mr. Speaker, when is the government going to do something about this long-winded, cumbersome and complicated process of applying for universal credit? I have a constituent who applied in September and has only received one payment, and we're now in mid-January, mainly because of mistakes made by officials in the department. When is the government going to do something about this?
That's right, Mark.
Mr. Speaker, if he has a specific case, I'll be very happy to look at it. I would just point out that actually payment periods have been, payment timeliness has been increasing under universal credit, but one of the reasons that we may not be able to make full payments to people is because we're waiting to verify some of their costs, which may relate to childcare or rental or whatever. But in terms of the case he's raised, very happy to talk to him about it.
Sammy Wilson.
I know from private conversations with the Minister that he genuinely does want this system to work, and I welcome the changes that he has made. Could I suggest to him that when it comes to the migration of existing legacy benefits, that instead of requesting the applicant to provide the information, the Department uses the information it already has available and works out what is available to, or what payments should be made payable to the person?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his kind words. And of course, again, he's raised the issue of pre-population. We've set out to, in our response to the Social Security Advisory Committee, what we plan to do. But the key thing is we need to make sure we get all the information so we can pay people the full amount that they're due.
Ellen Jones.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Last year, several newspapers carried harrowing accounts of women forced to seek abortions simply because of the two-child limit policy. I hear what the Minister has said about retrospective changes, but how will what has been proposed help women who have unplanned pregnancies and wish to go ahead with their pregnancy do so?
Mr. Speaker, as she will know, we have a set of exemptions in the policy already. We announced recently 2 further exemptions. But what I would just say to her, that in terms of the overall policy, this was tested in the courts last year and was found to be sound.
Edwards.
Mr. Speaker, will the British Government extend much-needed transitional protection to people who are migrating naturally to a change of circumstance?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the best way that he can make sure that we provide support in terms of transitional protection for those who migrate across is actually to support the affirmative regulations when we have a vote on them.
Kane. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 60 bishops wrote to the government condemning the two-child limit last year. Does the Minister counsel those bishops to advise their flocks considering having the third child to exercise more social responsibility?
Mr. Speaker, when I met parliamentary colleagues recently to discuss the two-child policy, that particular meeting was chaired by the Bishop of Durham, and we have made changes to the policy, but I would say that overall what this policy is about is being fair to the taxpayer and being sustainable at the same time.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Some EU citizens are now being refused universal credit as they can't produce proof of residency rights. This is particularly affecting women in a caring role who have worked less and paid less tax. I welcome the Secretary of State's wish to reduce the impact of universal credit on women. So can his department review this scandal before it becomes a new shame on universal credit?
Mr. Speaker, there's a clear set of criteria which determine whether someone can claim universal credit, but where she has, well, what I would just say to her is where she has a specific case or specific sets of cases, she should come and discuss those with me.
Ooh, what a taxing choice. Mr. Alan Brown.
Hey, a good choice, Mr. Speaker. Further the question from Wemmer for Central Ayrshire. Has he assessed how many EU citizens that made their lives here are now routinely being turned down for universal credit? People like my constituent Laura Nanny, who until we got a decision overturned last week would have been evicted for rent arrears and left homeless and penniless. When will they look into this, and will they apologise to my constituent for DWP getting it wrong? And I know the Prime Minister sat next to him. I raised this matter at Prime Minister's questions, and she dismissed it out of hand.
Mr. Speaker, let me be absolutely clear. Where we get something wrong in the department, we apologise, and I write and apologise to individuals and colleagues. But where we have specific cases to raise, again, I'll be very happy to meet with him and his colleagues.
Drew Hendry.
Saving the best for last, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for nearly 6 years, from pilot through to full service rollout,
my constituents in Inverness and then the rest of my constituency have been suffering and reporting to this government on the flaws of universal credit. Now that these mistakes have been admitted to and the flaws have been acknowledged, what is he going to do to compensate those people who have endured that suffering?
Yeah, you say correct.
Mr. Speaker, I would just say that overall the universal credit policy is absolutely working. It is getting more people into work, and that ultimately is what the welfare system is also about. And I would just say to him is that where he has individual cases, as he himself knows, I'm very happy to take those up and discuss them with him.
Thank you. Order. Statement, the Prime Minister.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to update the House on the further assurances and clarifications we have received from the European Union on the Northern Ireland Protocol. As a proud unionist, I share the concerns of members who want to ensure that in leaving the European Union we do not undermine the strength of our own union in the UK. That is why, when the EU tried to insist on a protocol that would carve out Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK's customs territory, I said no. And I secured instead a UK-wide temporary customs arrangement, avoiding both a hard border on the island of Ireland and a customs border down the Irish Sea. I also negotiated substantial commitments in the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration to do everything possible to prevent the backstop ever being needed, and to ensure that if it were, it would be a temporary arrangement. But listening to the debate before Christmas, it was clear that we needed to go further. So I returned to Brussels to faithfully and firmly reflect the concerns of this House. The conclusions of December's Council went further in addressing our concerns. They included reaffirming the EU's determination to work speedily to establish by the 31st of December 2020 alternative arrangements so that the backstop will not need to be triggered. They underlined that if the backstop were nevertheless to be triggered, it would indeed apply temporarily. They committed that in such an event, the EU would use their best endeavours to continue to negotiate and conclude as soon as possible a subsequent agreement that would replace the backstop. And they gave a new assurance that negotiations on the future relationship could start immediately after the UK's withdrawal. Since the Council and throughout the Christmas and New Year period, I've spoken to a number of European leaders, and there have been further discussions with the EU to seek further assurances alongside the Council conclusions. And today I have published the outcome of these further discussions with an exchange of letters between the UK Government and the Presidents of the European Commission and European Council. The letter from President Tusk confirms what I said in the House before Christmas, namely that the assurances in the European Council conclusions have legal standing in the EU. Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Attorney-General, has also written to me today, confirming that in the light of the joint response from the Presidents of the European Council and the Commission, these conclusions, quote, would have legal force in international law, and setting out his opinion, reinforced by today's letter, that the balance of risks favours the conclusion that it is unlikely that the EU will wish to rely on the implementation of the backstop provisions, and further that it is therefore his judgment that the current draft withdrawal agreement now represents the only politically practicable and available means of securing our exit from the European Union. Mr. Speaker, I know that some members would ideally like a unilateral exit mechanism or a hard time limit to the backstop. I've explained this to the EU and tested these points in negotiations, but the EU would not agree to this because they fear that such a provision could allow the UK to leave the backstop at any time without any other arrangements in place and require a hard border to be erected between Northern Ireland and Ireland. I have been very clear with them that this is not something we would ever countenance, that the UK is steadfast in its commitment to the Belfast Agreement and would never allow a return to a hard border. But it is not enough simply to say this. Both sides also need to take steps to avoid a hard border when the UK is outside of the EU. Failing to do so would place businesses on the island of Ireland in an impossible position, having to choose between costly new checks and procedures that would disrupt their supply chains or breaking the law. So we have the backstop as a last resort. But both the Taoiseach and I have said consistently that the best way to avoid a hard border is through the future relationship. That is the sustainable solution, and that neither of us want to use the backstop. So since the Council, we've been looking at commitments that would ensure we get our future relationship or alternative arrangements in place by the end of the implementation period, so that there will be no need to enter the backstop and no need for any fear that there will be a hard border. And that is why, in the first of the further assurances they've provided today, the EU has committed to begin exploratory talks on the detailed legal provisions of the future relationship as soon as this Parliament has approved the deal and the withdrawal agreement has been signed, and they have been explicit that this can happen immediately after this House votes through the agreement. If this House approved the deal tomorrow, it would give us almost 2 years to complete the next phase of the negotiations. And of course, we will have the option to extend the implementation period if further time were needed for either 1 or 2 years. It is my absolute conviction that we can turn the political declaration into legal text in that time, avoiding the need for the backstop altogether. The letters also make clear that these talks should give particular urgency to discussion of ideas, including the use of all available facilitative arrangements and technologies for replacing the backstop with permanent arrangements, and further, that those arrangements are not required to replicate the backstop provisions in any respect. So, contrary to the fears of some honourable members, the EU will not simply insist that the backstop is the only way to avoid a hard border. They have agreed to discuss technological solutions and any alternative means of delivering on this objective, and to get on with this as a priority in the next phase of negotiations. Second, the EU has now committed to a fast-track process to bring our future trade deal into force once it has been agreed. If there is any delay in ratification, the Commission has now said they will recommend provisionally applying the relevant parts of the agreement so that we would not need to enter the backstop. Such a provisional application process saved 4 years on the EU-Korea deal, and it would prevent any delays in ratification by other EU member state parliaments from delaying our deal coming into force. Third, the EU has provided absolute clarity on the explicit linkage between the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, and made that link clear in the way the documents are presented. I know some colleagues are worried about an imbalance between the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, because the EU cannot reach a legal agreement with us on the future relationship until we are a third country. But the link between them means the commitments of one cannot be banked without the commitments of the other, and the EU have been clear they come as a package. Bad faith by either side in negotiating the legal instruments that will deliver the future relationship laid out in the political declaration would be a breach of their legal obligations under the withdrawal agreement. Fourth, the exchange of letters confirms that the UK can unilaterally deliver all of the commitments we made last week to safeguard the interests of the people and businesses of Northern Ireland and their position in our precious union. For it gives clear answers to address some questions that have been raised since the deal was reached. That the deal means no change to the arrangements which underpin North-South cooperation in the Belfast Agreement. That Stormont will have a lock on any new laws the EU proposes should be added to the backstop, and that the UK can give a restored Northern Ireland executive a seat at the table on the joint committee overseeing the deal. Mr. Speaker, President Juncker says explicitly in his letter that the backstop would represent a sub-optimal trading relationship for both sides. We've spoken at length about why we want to avoid the backstop, but it is not in the EU's interests either. For this backstop gives the UK tariff-free access to the EU's market. It does so with no free movement of people, no financial contribution, no requirement to follow most of the level playing field rules, and no need to allow EU boats any access to our waters for fishing. Furthermore, under these arrangements, UK authorities in Northern Ireland would clear goods for release into the EU single market with no further checks or controls. This is unprecedented and means the EU relying on the UK for the functioning of its own market. So the EU will not want this backstop to come into force, and the exchange of letters today makes clear that if it did, they would do all they could to bring it to an end as quickly as possible. Nevertheless, Mr Speaker, I fully understand that these new assurances still will not go as far as some would like. I recognise that some members wanted to see changes to the withdrawal agreement, a unilateral exit mechanism from the backstop, an end date, or rejecting the backstop altogether. Although it should be said that this would have risked other EU member states attempting to row back on the significant wins we had already achieved, such as on control over our waters or the sovereignty of Gibraltar. But the simple truth is this: the EU was not prepared to agree to this, and rejecting the backstop altogether means no deal. Whatever version of the future relationship you might want to see, from Norway to Canada to any number of variations, all of them require a withdrawal agreement, and any withdrawal agreement will contain the backstop. And that is not going to change, however the House votes tomorrow. And to those who think we should reject this deal in favour of no deal because we cannot get every assurance we want, I ask, what would a no-deal Brexit do to strengthen the hand of those campaigning for Scottish independence, or indeed those demanding a border poll in Northern Ireland? Surely this is the real threat to our union. Mr Speaker, with just 74 days until the 29th of March, the consequences of voting against this deal tomorrow are becoming ever clearer. With no deal, we would have no implementation period, no security partnership, no guarantees for UK citizens overseas, and no certainty for businesses and workers like those I met in Stoke this morning. And we would see changes to everyday life in Northern Ireland that would put the future of our union at risk. And if, rather than leaving with no deal, this House blocked Brexit, that would be a subversion of our democracy, saying to the people we were elected to serve that we were unwilling to do what they had instructed. So I say to members on all sides of this House, whatever you may have previously concluded, over these next 24 hours, give this deal a second look. No, it is not perfect, and yes, it is a compromise. But when the history books are written, people will look at the decision. People will look at the decision of this House tomorrow and ask, did we deliver on the country's vote to leave the European Union? Did we safeguard our economy, our security and our union? Or did we let the British people down? I say we should deliver for the British people and get on with building a brighter future for our country by backing this deal tomorrow, and I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would like to thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of her statement. In December, the government shamefully pulled the meaningful vote on her deal, with a promise that the Prime Minister would secure legal assurances from the EU that the backstop would be temporary. The Leader of the House confirmed this, saying the Prime Minister is determined to get the legal reassurances that members want to see, while the Foreign Secretary told us the Prime Minister would find a way to win tomorrow's common vote by getting assurances with legal force that the Irish border backstop is only temporary. On receiving this letter today, to the Prime Minister from the President of the EU Commission and the Council, it must now be clear to all members across this House, yet again, the Prime Minister has completely and utterly failed to do that. Today's letter is nothing more than a repetition of exactly the same position that was pulled more than 1 month ago. It categorically does not give the legal assurances this House was promised and contains nothing but warm words and aspirations. Mr Speaker, isn't it the case that absolutely nothing has changed from the Attorney-General's letter of advice to the Cabinet? His advice, which the government tried to hide, explained with great clarity the reasons why the UK could find itself locked into the Northern Ireland backstop protocol with no legal escape route. Today's letter means nothing. The truth remains that by the end of 2020, the UK will face a choice of either extending the transition period, which comes at an unknown financial cost, or we will fall into the backstop which the Attorney-General has said endures indefinitely until such time as an agreement supersedes it. He has himself updated his legal advice today, as the Prime Minister just said, and he clearly says, and I quote, "They do not alter the fundamental meanings as he advised them in November." If there were legally binding assurances on the temporary nature of the backstop, then surely they would have been written into the withdrawal agreement itself. The letter published this morning is clear that this is not possible, saying we are not in a position to agree to anything that changes or is inconsistent with the withdrawal agreement. Mr. Speaker, this morning's joint letter does say negotiations can start as soon as possible after the withdrawal from the UK. But my question to the Prime Minister is, how is that possible when the Cabinet cannot agree it amongst themselves? That is why the political declaration is so vague. Actually, Mr. Speaker, I believe the right word is nebulous. Given the Prime Minister has failed to secure the promised changes, there can be no question of once again ducking accountability and avoiding tomorrow's vote. No more playing for time, no more running down the clock to scare people into backing this damaging shambles of a deal. I'm sure members across the House will not be fooled by what has been produced today. It's clear what we are voting on this week is exactly the same deal we should have voted on in December. I'm sure the Prime Minister knows this. That is why today she's trying to blame others for this chaos. Given the lack of support for the Prime Minister's deal, you might have thought she would try to reach out to MPs. Instead, the Prime Minister is claiming that by failing to support her botched deal, members are threatening to undermine the faith of the British people in our democracy. Mr. Speaker, the only people who are undermining faith in our democracy is the government itself. Mr. Speaker, I can think of no greater example of democracy in action than for this House to reject a deal that is clearly bad for this country. During the past 2 years of shambolic negotiations, the Prime Minister has failed to listen. She hasn't once tried to work with Parliament to construct a Brexit deal that this House and the country can support, and now she's left facing a humiliating defeat and is blaming everybody but herself. Mr. Speaker, if this deal is rejected tomorrow, and I hope it is, the blame will lie firmly with the government and firmly at the feet of the Prime Minister. There is a deal that could command support in the House, which would include a new and comprehensive customs union, a strong single market relationship, and a guarantee to keep pace with European Union rights and standards. Instead, the Prime Minister still chooses to take the most reckless path. Mr. Speaker, as we enter the week of the meaningful vote, we should remember the meaningful vote only happened because of pressure from the opposition in this House. Let us remember the incompetence we've been forced to endure. We've seen 2 years of shambolic negotiations, red lines announced then cast aside. We're now on our third Brexit secretary, all of whom have been largely excluded from the vital stages of the negotiations. We were promised the easiest trade deal in history, yet we've seen a divided government deliver a botched withdrawal deal with nothing more than a vague outline for what our future relationship with the EU will be. Meanwhile, conditions in this country with millions of people continue to get worse. We just had an urgent question about universal credit and the disaster that is for millions of people in this country. Mr. Speaker, the government is in disarray. It's clear, if the Prime Minister's deal is rejected tomorrow, it's time for a general election. It's time for a new government.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure that there were many questions to me in the response that the right honourable gentleman gave, but let me respond to some of the points of fact that he referenced, some of which were perhaps not as correct as they might have been. He said, of course, there is no legal termination mechanism in the withdrawal agreement from on the backstop. There is, but the point is that it is not a unilateral termination mechanism. It is a termination mechanism which requires agreement between the two parties. He said that in December 2020 we would face either having the backstop or the implementation period extension. Of course, the point is we are negotiating to ensure that at that point no such choice will be necessary because we will have the future arrangement in place. He says that it's not possible to start the negotiations as soon as the withdrawal agreement, the meaningful vote has been held and agreement has been given to the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. Indeed, Whitehall stands ready to start those negotiations. We have been looking at what, because we know the basis of those negotiations, it's in the political declaration, and everybody is ready to start those as soon as possible. He talked about at the end about universal credit. Can I just remind the right honourable gentleman that under this government 3.4 million more jobs have been created. That means all those people able to earn a regular wage to help support their families. And under universal credit, we see a system that is helping people to get into the workplace rather than leaving them living on benefits for nearly a decade, as happened under the last Labour government. And finally, he calls, as he does regularly, for a general election. And here I think we saw yesterday that the right honourable gentleman isn't thinking about the national interest, he is merely playing politics. Because yesterday, when asked whether there was a general election, he would actually campaign to leave the European Union. He refused to answer that question 5 times. We know where we stand. We're leaving the European Union, and this government will deliver it.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, I congratulate the Prime Minister on getting rather further than I thought she would with the assurances and the letters that she's obtained. But I fear it will do no good because she's up against two bodies of opinion. One are the hardline Brexiteers on this side and the Leader of the Opposition and his front bench, who think if they call crisis and deadlock, it will result in leaving with no deal. And the others is a lot of hardline Remainers, largely on the backbenches of the Labour Party, who think if they cause chaos and deadlock, it will lead to a second referendum. One of them is wrong. But the problem is she's up against both of them. Does she accept that if we lift our eyes from the present chaos and look to what the country needs, beyond our leaving the EU if the House of Commons insists on doing that, we need a permanently open border in Ireland for treaty and security reasons, and we need a permanently open border for economic reasons across the Channel for our trade and investment. And does she accept that it is difficult to proceed until there's some consensus for that across this House of Commons, and doesn't look as though we're going to get there by March the 29th, which is a date that should obviously be delayed?
I thank my right honourable and learned friend for his point and for his question. I don't believe that the date of the 29th of March should be delayed. I think my right honourable and learned friend sets out that there are those who want to see no deal and those who want to see a second referendum and potentially frustrate Brexit. The inexorable logic of that, if this House wants to ensure that we are delivering on Brexit for the British people, is to back the deal that will be before this House tomorrow. And on the issue of the borders and the question of obviously we want to make sure that there is a consistently and sustainably into the long term open border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. That is our commitment to ensure there is no hard border there. There would be economic advantage in an open border and frictionless trade with between the UK and the European Union, and that's exactly the proposal that the government has put forward.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of her statement, though I'm left asking myself, is that it? Is that all you've got, Prime Minister? Because nothing has fundamentally changed. It is a wish list. With little more than 24 hours until this House votes on the Prime Minister's deal, the Prime Minister comes back completely humiliated. The letters published between the UK Government and the European Union reveal that the Prime Minister has utterly failed to get the concessions she promised. The EU letter explicitly insists there cannot be any renegotiation of the backstop or the withdrawal agreement. Mr. Speaker, the EU letter states we are not in a position to agree to anything that changes or is inconsistent with the withdrawal agreement. The Prime Minister is simply in fantasy land, presenting her statement as bringing changes when they are not. Mr. Speaker, this government must stop threatening no deal. It is time to face reality. Extend Article 50 and let the people decide. And let me say this to the Prime Minister. In Scotland, people know that it is the Tory government dragging Scotland out of the European Union against our will. It is the Tories treating the Scottish Parliament with contempt. And it is this Prime Minister and this Tory party that continues to silence Scotland's voice and sideline our interests. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister this morning said, what if we found ourselves in a situation where Parliament tried to take the UK out of the EU in opposition to a Remain vote? People's faith in the democratic processes and their politicians would suffer catastrophic harm. And yet, she is demanding precisely that in Scotland, taking Scotland out of the EU in opposition to an overwhelming Remain vote. To people in Scotland, the Prime Minister has made it clear that time and time again our voices are not to be listened to. The Prime Minister talks about respecting the results of referendums. The same Prime Minister who voted against Welsh devolution, who voted to wreck the Scottish devolution referendum as well. Mr. Speaker, this is a defining moment. The people of Scotland know more than ever that what comes from a Tory government that we did not vote for. So why does the Prime Minister continue to ignore Scotland's voices and Scotland's interests? Why is the Prime Minister so petrified of allowing the people decide? Now we know the facts. And if she's not, will she now do the right thing? Extend Article 50. Let the people decide.
Minister. I say to the right honourable gentleman that the people across the United Kingdom did decide. They decided in June 2016. They decided that we should leave the European Union, and I believe it is absolutely right that this government is intent on delivering, committed to delivering on the vote of the British people. And he talks about the interests of Scotland. Of course, as he knows, the interests of Scotland are best served by ensuring that Scotland remains as part of the United Kingdom. And if the SNP is so clear that a politician should listen to the voice of the people, then the SNP should listen to the voice of the Scottish people expressed in the referendum in 2014 and abandon the idea of independence.
Sir John Redwood.
Given that the EU intends to take huge sums of money and powers off us in return for just 21 or 45 months of more talks and massive uncertainty, why should we ever believe the EU would give us a good deal when they pocket all that they want up front?
Prime Minister.
To my right honourable friend, that throughout the negotiations we have actually ensured that the European Union has had to concede to the United Kingdom government in a whole range of areas on which they did not wish to concede. But if we look into the future, I believe it is, and we do have, my right honourable friend and I do have a difference of opinion in this, in that he believes that WTO terms are right for our future trade with the European Union. I think a more ambitious free trade agreement between us and the European Union is what is right. That's what's set out in the political declaration, and that's what I believe is the good deal for the UK in leaving the EU.
Sir Vincent Cable.
The Prime Minister's confirmed today that under her deal, Britain will remain between 2 and 4 years, possibly longer, in a customs union. The Leader of the Opposition is supporting Brexit with a somewhat longer period in a customs union. With that relatively small difference, aren't they essentially two peas in a pod?
Minister?
No, definitely not.
Sir William Cash.
Will my right honourable friend confirm what she said at Stoke today, namely that she will never extend the date of our leaving beyond the 29th of March this year, and never, in any circumstances whatsoever, allow the repeal of the Withdrawal Act and the European Communities Act 1972 under that Act?
Minister.
To my honourable friend, I did indeed confirm that I believe our intent is what the government is working for is to leave the European Union on the 29th of March. There are those who may try to find ways to prevent that from happening. I think that is a real risk, but the government is firm in its commitment in relation to leaving the European Union. And in relation to the issue that my honourable friend has raised on the Withdrawal Act, we have passed the Withdrawal Act through this House, through this Parliament. It does repeal the 1972 European Communities Act. Of course, for the period of the implementation period, it would be necessary within the WAB, as my honourable friend knows, to ensure that we are still able to maintain the rules that we need to operate by in order to abide by the negotiated agreement on the implementation period. But I can assure him it remains the commitment of this government to leave the European Union on the 29th of March.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, I know the Prime Minister is totally sincere in her sense of duty to this country and in her belief in her deal. But I want to turn her attention to something she doesn't want to contemplate, which is defeat tomorrow night. And I say to her in the strongest terms that the tone and substance she strikes in the wake of that eventuality will define her legacy to this country. And I want to urge her not to succumb to this absurd argument this is a war between this House and the government, when this government is a servant of this House. And I want to urge her also, Mr. Speaker, to, if she loses tomorrow night, give this House an open and honest process where it can express its view, and she and the government then becomes the servant of this House in the negotiations.
Prime Minister.
The government is a servant of the people. We are ensuring that we are delivering what the people want in relation to Brexit. Now, we've negotiated what I believe genuinely is a good deal for the United Kingdom, and that is why I will continue to encourage members of this House to support it.
Owen Patterson.
Speaker, it's absolutely clear the British government, the Irish government and the European Union always said there will be no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And today's border works perfectly satisfactorily with electronic means. It is extraordinary and exasperating that we are still stuck on the question of the backstop when the Prime Minister has met technical experts who know that existing techniques and processes could deliver smooth delivery of that border. What meetings have been held since she met those experts prior to pulling the vote in December?
Minister. Honourable friend, it is exactly those sorts of technological solutions that we are committed to pursuing. As I have said to my right honourable friend when he brought a proposal to me, the proposal he brought to me did not fully address all of the issues in relation to the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, but we are continuing to look and will look actively and with the European Union at the ways in which we could ensure that those alternative arrangements would deal with the issue that we're addressing. But can I also say to my right honourable friend, it is not the case that the European Union has said that there will be no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. The no-deal plans published by the European Commission in December make clear there will be no flexibility on border checks in no deal, so the Irish Government would be expected to apply EU checks in full.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To be fair to the EU, they have made it clear that there will be no changes to the withdrawal agreement, and there's nothing in these letters that is inconsistent with the withdrawal agreement. To be fair to the Attorney-General, he says in his letter today that the letters do not alter the fundamental meanings of its provisions. So 5 weeks since the Prime Minister pulled the vote saying that there had to be legally binding assurance, will she admit that nothing has fundamentally changed? I mean, that's the reality. Let's not kid ourselves about that. And will she not recognise that in pulling the vote, she must have realised that there needed to be legally binding changes to the withdrawal agreement in order for it to have any chance of getting through this House? And even at this late stage, will she not accept that the problem with the backstop is that it effectively defines the future relationship for Northern Ireland, because if the whole of the UK is not aligned to a high degree for single market purposes and we're in a customs union, Northern Ireland will be.
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that it was right that I took the views of this House. The overwhelming view of this House on the backstop was that people wanted to ensure that the backstop would not carry on indefinitely or be a permanent arrangement. The right honourable gentleman has just indicated he thinks that is what the case is for the backstop. What we have received from the European Union are those further assurances and the recognition that the European Council conclusion, in which some of those assurances are referred to, does have legal force in international law and effectively sits alongside the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration package, and would be part of any consideration on any challenge to that withdrawal agreement in relation to those particular issues. But I recognise that what I have brought back, as I said in my statement, is not what some members wanted from the European Union. But it is not the case that this has not gone further than when we were initially discussing the debate. There have been some further assurances from the European Union, but I accept that those are not the same level of assurance that some members of this House wished.
Anna Seabury.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is right when she says that she's a servant of the people. There are 2 million young people who weren't able to vote back in 2016, 2.5 years ago. I'm so sorry that honourable members seem to, on this side, be in some way dismissing those young people. They are the future of our country. The Treasury's own analysis shows that whichever way you cut it, Brexit's going to make our country poorer. Why shouldn't they have a right to a say in their future, given they will bear the brunt of Brexit? Why, tomorrow, when the Prime Minister's deal fails, why can't it go back to the British people so that everybody, especially young people, can have their say on their future, their say on Brexit?
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend has asked me questions in relation to putting a decision back to the British people in the past, as have other honourable and right honourable members of this House, and referred to a new generation of young people who weren't able to vote in the 2016 referendum. But this House, this Parliament, was very clear that this was a decision to be taken in that referendum, and that government would abide by the decision that was taken in that referendum. And 80% of the votes cast at the last general election were for parties that said they would respect the result of the referendum. That I believe we should respect the result of the referendum and ensure that we deliver leaving the European Union.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. We will find out tomorrow evening whether the House is willing to support the Prime Minister's deal. But what is now clear is that the EU will not be able to offer her any further help, because as long as it continues to say we're not in a position to agree to anything that changes the withdrawal agreement, a number of her backbenchers will not be reassured. So while the Prime Minister will, for the next 26 hours at least, argue that we should back her deal, can I invite her today to commit, if she loses, to reach out across the House in order to try and find a way out of the crisis that is facing our country, that can command the support of Parliament, and that, if necessary, in order to do that, she should be willing to seek an extension to Article 50.
Prime Minister.
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that, of course, the House will give its view tomorrow night. I will be continuing to encourage members of this House to vote for what I believe to be a good deal. He might have noticed, actually, I have been meeting with and hearing from members across across the House in relation to this particular issue. I will continue to believe that this is a good deal because it delivers on the referendum, and it is crucial that this House delivers on the referendum, but it also does so in a way that protects people's jobs and security and gives certainty to businesses, and that's why I believe it's a good deal.
Mr. Patrick McLaughlin.
No one is ever going to get what they want fully out of negotiations. But the very simple fact that all the leaders of our major industries, including Rolls-Royce, Toyota, JLR, have said that this deal is the right deal for them to continue winning markets and employing people in this country. Isn't that one of the most important decisions we should take in mind in trying to protect jobs, manufacturing jobs, and our country's future?
Right Honourable Friend is absolutely right, but I would say to him it isn't just the leaders of manufacturing industry. He's absolutely right. They have made clear that this is a good deal and a deal that should be supported, but others have too. So we have seen Scottish fishermen, for example, we've seen farmers also saying that this is a deal that should be supported. And I think when members of the House think about the jobs of their constituents, it's important that they remember that.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Prime Minister comes hot foot from her speech in Stoke, where she commanded us to honour the result of the referendum. Yet, in 1997, she voted against legislation to establish the National Assembly of Wales, and in 2005 stood on a manifesto calling for another referendum with the option to overturn the result. How does the Prime Minister square her personal track record on referendums with such commands?
Prime Minister.
The Conservative Party, of course, we went into opposition in 1997. We accepted the vote, the result of the referendum vote in Wales. Yes. We respected and made clear at the time that we respected the result of that referendum in Wales. And I think anybody who sees the Welsh Assembly today and what it has been doing over recent years will recognise that was a right decision.
Mr. David Jones.
May I commend my right honourable friend for listening to the concerns of honourable members and for seeking to obtain further concessions and clarifications from the European Union. But is it not the case that the use of those words by Presidents Juncker and Tusk, that we are not in a position to agree to anything that changes or is inconsistent with the withdrawal agreement, simply serves to underline those concerns and make it all the more likely that honourable members will reject the withdrawal agreement tomorrow?
I say to my honourable friend that the concern that members had overwhelmingly raised was the issue of whether or not the backstop could continue indefinitely. The European Union, within the withdrawal agreement, in a number of ways, makes clear that the backstop can only be a temporary arrangement. They have given that further assurance in relation to this in Council conclusions, which have, as I say, a legal force in international law, and that has been confirmed here in the UK. So they have gone further than they did within the withdrawal agreement. But I've said to the House on many occasions, there is no deal with the European Union that does not involve a withdrawal agreement. There is no deal that does not involve having a backstop, as that commitment to the people of Northern Ireland that there will be no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland.
Yvette Cooper.
The Prime Minister said this morning that she called on everyone to move beyond division and come together. Does she not recognise that she has made the divisions worse and made it harder for people to come together by not consulting either Parliament or the public on her red lines or the negotiating objectives, and by ducking and delaying votes? Does she not recognise that brinkmanship is the worst possible way to make such big decisions for the future of our country? And will she tell the House now that she has not ruled out extending Article 50 if her plan is rejected tomorrow?
I say to the Right Honourable Lady, I have said on many occasions in this House, I have come regularly to this House and answered questions from honourable members about the position that the government has been taking on these particular matters, and I am clear, in fact it is in our legislation, that we should leave the European Union on the 29th of March this year.
Sir Nicholas Soames.
Mr. Speaker, will my right honourable friend the Prime Minister reconfirm to the House that whatever future trading relationship the United Kingdom wishes to have with the European Union, this withdrawal agreement is clearly absolutely necessary to securing it?
Can I say that he is absolutely right. The point is there are two issues here. There's how we leave the European Union and what our future relationship is. And any trade agreement that we would wish to agree with the European Union will require us to have these details of the withdrawal agreement agreed. As I said previously, any withdrawal agreement will include a backstop.
Looking for a new young member. Mr. Betty Shearman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Prime Minister to go back to that very good question asked by her colleague, the Right Honourable Member for Rushcliffe, where he made a very intelligent plea for more time. This is one of the most important decisions that we will make, let alone this century, the last 100 years. Why should we rush it? It is complex. Her statement today shows how complex it is. We need more time. Why can't we have it?
Prime Minister. The Right Honourable Gentleman, that it will be March 29th of this year will be almost 3 years since people voted for us to leave the European Union. This House voted overwhelmingly to trigger Article 50 in the knowledge that Article 50 had a set time for the process and that meant we would be leaving on a particular date.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The withdrawal agreement is, of course, a draft international treaty. And if we were to vote for it tomorrow and then ratify it, it would be binding upon us in international law. So it would outrank legally any motion or amendment of this House or even an act of Parliament. And the agreement says that itself, it confirms it in black and white in Article 4 on page 11. So the question is, do these letters have any legal power over the treaty? Now, the Prime Minister quoted from the Attorney General's advice, the operative paragraph 2, but if she'll forgive me, she quoted selectively. The paragraph, which is brief, reads, "I agree that in the light of this response, the Council's conclusions of the 13th December 2018 would have legal force in international law and thus be relevant and cognisable in the interpretation of the withdrawal agreement, and in particular the Northern Ireland Protocol, albeit they do not alter the fundamental meanings of its provisions as I advised them to be on the 13th of November 2018. In other words, the letters don't overrule the treaty. They're a fig leaf, and a small fig leaf at that. Isn't that true?
Prime Minister.
These are additional to the text that is in the treaty, and they do have force in international law. But I'll say to my right honourable friend, I was clear in my statement, and I have said that since, that I recognise that what we have from the European Union does not go as far as some members of this House would like it to go and would prefer it to go. But we do have those further assurances which sit alongside the withdrawal agreement, and in any position in which the question about the backstop within the withdrawal agreement was being challenged, these would be part of that consideration and would be, as has been said, they do have a force in international law.
Chris Leslie.
To be clear on the Prime Minister's strategy, she's asking us to trust her to agree to get past exit day before we even start to negotiate the whole of the future relationship between the EU and the UK. Doesn't she accept that would be a massive leap in the dark, and anything could happen in that 2-year period? For example, who will be her successor concluding those negotiations?
Prime Minister.
Right Honourable Gentleman, that the political declaration sets out the instructions to the negotiators for the next stage in relation to not just the trade arrangements but also the security arrangements and indeed some issues underpinning all of these, for example the data, questions of data exchange. So those are the instructions on which the negotiators for the next stage will be working on that to change it into legal text. It is not possible for the EU to agree a legally binding text of a trade agreement with a country that is a member of the European Union. They have to wait until we are a third country and outside the European Union.
Greg Hands.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will have read the comments from leading EU Commission officials at the very highest levels about the withdrawal agreement since it was finalised. Sabine Vaillant, who is Michel Barnier's deputy, has said, first, this requires the customs union as the basis for the future relationship. She's also said they must align their rules, but the EU will retain all the controls. And finally, that the EU retains its leverage. Martin Selmayr, who's the General Secretary of the Commission, has said, quote, the power is with us, and he told the Passauer Neue Presse on the 7th of December that the agreement shows that leaving the EU doesn't work. So Brussels clearly believes it's a great deal for them. Why does the Prime Minister seemingly as enthusiastic that this is a great deal for the United Kingdom?
First of all, can I say to my right honourable friend that what is clear in the letters that we've received today from the European Union is that the issues that form... I know a number of members were concerned about the phraseology that was in the political declaration about the future relationship in relation to customs and the phraseology of building on the protocol, and therefore the assumption that what was in the protocol was effectively going to have to be taken forward into that future relationship. In fact, the letters we have received today make clear that that is not the case. And I say to my right honourable friend, he asks why I believe this is a good deal. I believe it's a good deal because it does, as I've said previously, it does deliver on the vote of the referendum, control of money, borders and laws, out of the CFP, out of the CAP, but it also, and enabling us to have an independent trade policy, but it also enables us to do that in a way that protects jobs and security and gives certainty to businesses.
Kate Hoey.
Speaker, I genuinely respect the Prime Minister's willingness to come back time after time to talk to this Parliament and to the public about her deal, even if today she hasn't really brought anything very different back, if we're honest. But could I ask her to state very clearly, this Parliament voted to give the people the opportunity to decide whether to leave or not to leave, not for this Parliament to decide. Will she therefore categorically state that whatever happens tomorrow night and whatever happens in the next few weeks, we will be leaving on March the 29th because that's what the people voted for?
I say to the right honourable lady, we will be leaving the European Union on March the 29th. I believe it is important that this Parliament delivers on the vote that people took in 2016. And indeed, as I've just said in response to one of her honourable friends, this Parliament voted to trigger Article 50 with that 2-year time frame that Article 50 had within it. But it is important, for the sake of our democracy, I believe, that we do deliver on the Brexit vote that took place in 2016.
Mary Cray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Wakefield on Saturday, Mr. Speaker, a man approached me to say that on the day the Prime Minister delayed the vote, his business lost a multi-million-pound contract, and as a result, his order book was empty and the redundancies were now starting. So her delay has achieved nothing apart from the paradox of leaving her a little bit safer in her job, thanks to surviving a vote of no confidence, and my constituents quite a lot less safe in their jobs. So when her deal is voted down tomorrow, will she extend Article 50 and work across this House to give our constituents the option to vote again on what they now know is going to happen, which is continued uncertainty on the trading relationship between their businesses and the EU for at least the next 4 years?
What business is absolutely clear that the certainty that they require is the certainty that will be given by agreeing this deal.
Sir Desmond Swain.
To guarantee Brexit, she should prorogue Parliament until April. Tempting, isn't it?
Can I just say to my right honourable friend, he's trying to tempt me down a road that I don't think I should go down. But were Parliament to prorogue until April, I would be denied the opportunity to be able to see my right honourable friend and answer his questions on a regular basis, and that would be very sad.
George Howarth.
I accept, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister has tried her best. But doesn't she accept that everything she said today doesn't alter the fact that she has no majority in this Parliament, no authority in the country, and her government now serves no useful purpose.
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that yes, the government is getting on with what we believe is right in putting a deal to this Parliament to deliver on Brexit and deliver for the British people. But can I also say to him that this isn't the only thing this government has been involved in. I would hope that when he talks about what the government has been doing, he would recognise the importance of the long-term plan for the National Health Service and the significant investment in the National Health Service which this government has agreed and is going to put in.
Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In her statement, my right honourable friend points out that the EU will not agree to an end date to the backstop or a unilateral exit mechanism. Does that make her doubt their sincerity when they say they don't really want the backstop?
Minister. To my honourable friend, that the concern that the European Union has about those two options are, as I said in my statement, that somehow the United Kingdom would try to engineer a situation where it simply pulled out and erected, and there was a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. They want to guarantee that there is will be no such hard border. Now, I have said to the European Union, Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. We want to guarantee that commitment to the people of Northern Ireland because it's important, because they are part of the United Kingdom. But the European Union has been clear that in every circumstance, whatever the trade agreement that was negotiated in the future, whatever the withdrawal agreement, that they would require a backstop to be part of that. What we can do is ensure that we get the future relationship in place such that the backstop is never needed, and that were it to be needed, it was only temporary. It's getting that future relationship in place which enables us to ensure the long-term sustainability of the guarantee that we've given to the people of Northern Ireland.
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In spite of what we heard from the Prime Minister just a few minutes ago, the Prime Minister was one of 144 Tory MPs who voted against the foundation of the Welsh Assembly back in December 1999. That was 18 months after the referendum result. Why was it acceptable for her to do that then, but conversely ruling out today the opportunity for this country, including 2 million young people who didn't have a say back in 2016, to have that people's vote on the actual terms of the withdrawal agreement?
I didn't answer the specific point about young people when my right honourable friend, the member for Broxtowe, raised that question, so I would like to address it now. Because I recognise that there are people today who are now eligible to vote who weren't eligible to vote in 2016. But I have to say to those members who say that that is a reason for having a second vote, actually, regardless of how that vote went, then people could say in 2 years' time there's another group of young people who should be voting, and therefore we should have another vote. No, Parliament was clear. The decision on 2016 was a decision that would be delivered.
Victoria Prentice.
Tempting as it is to sex up international law by talking about fig leaves, could the Prime Minister confirm to me that the status of these letters from the EU today is legally binding if we were to have, say, an arbitration under international law in the future?
Yes, and I'm very happy to respond to my honourable friend, who, of course, with her legal experience, has rather more experience of these matters than I do. But it is right, they do have that legal force. They would be taken into account in looking at any arbitration, any dispute that arose. This would be part of the consideration that would be taken into account. So they do have that legal force.
Stephen Doughty. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I gently say to the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, that whatever our views in Brexit across this House, we are all patriots, and it is not subversive to take a different view from the Prime Minister. It is simply democracy in action. And it's not subversive because otherwise the position that the Prime Minister and indeed the Conservative Party took for nearly 8 years after Welsh devolution would also have been subversive. It wasn't, it was just a different point of view. I'm very proud the Welsh Assembly is in my constituency and it's there today. But would the Prime Minister agree with me there was a fundamental difference between Welsh devolution and Brexit? Support for Welsh devolution grew. That's why she wasn't successful in her call for another referendum or abolishing the Welsh Assembly. Support for Brexit has fallen, and that is exactly why we need to put it back to the people.
I'm afraid afraid I don't accept the underlying premise of the honourable gentleman's question, that he thinks that support for Brexit has fallen. There are indeed people who say that they voted leave, but they would now vote to remain. There are also people who say they voted remain, who would now vote to leave the European Union. And the overwhelming view that I get when I knock on doors and hear from people directly is actually that they just want the government to get on with the job that people gave to the government of leaving the EU.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you very much. Last week, the Shadow Brexit Secretary implied that he supported much of the withdrawal agreement, but he would vote against it because he wanted more clarity on the long-term relationship. But the EU has made it clear that we can't get the clarity on the long-term relationship before the withdrawal agreement. The horse has to come before the cart. Does she agree that it is the party opposite who are therefore being reckless in jeopardising our chances to move on with the negotiations before Europe shuts for its elections?
My honourable friend has made a very important point about the timing. We have the opportunity in agreeing this withdrawal agreement and political declaration to start those negotiations, to get that work going before those European parliamentary elections which take place in the summer. And it is indeed right that the EU cannot negotiate that legally binding text and sign up to that legally binding text until we're outside of the European Union, but are willing to start those negotiations so that we can ensure that we're in the best place possible to deliver the future relationship in December 2020.
Sir Mark Hendrick.
Prepared to hold this House to ransom. She knows she will lose the vote tomorrow and still insists on a March the 29th exit date, in spite of calls to extend Article 50. Would she really want to see this country crash out of the EU with all the losses of jobs and business that go with that?
Honourable gentleman, I've been very clear that if people want to avoid no deal, then what they should be doing is supporting this deal, which businesses like BAE Systems, which the honourable gentleman I'm sure will know, have said is a good deal and should be supported.
John Barron.
I'm just as aware that many of us have wished her well in these negotiations, but in the absence of any legal certainty about the UK's right to unilaterally leave the backstop, something my Amendment F seeks to address, what certainty is there that the EU doesn't drag out the trade negotiations so that in, say, 5 years' time, we're still discussing the issue?
Can I say to my honourable friend, and he and I have discussed this previously, the European Union do not see the situation that would exist where the trade negotiations were continuing for some considerable time, and if it were the case that the backstop had come into place, as a good place for the European Union. Tariff-free access to EU markets without paying any money, with no free movement of people and with no access for EU boats to our fishing waters, is not a good place for the European Union to be in. As I explained, the reason why they're concerned about the idea of a unilateral exit mechanism is because they do not want to see a situation in which the UK pulled out of the backstop and left the creation of a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And my honourable friend, I suspect, doesn't trust the European Union not to try to keep us in this backstop. They don't. Their concern is about whether they can trust us not to effectively leave a situation where there's a hard border, and it's finding a compromise between those two that we can all have confidence in that we've been working at.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister claims the possibility of no Brexit would be a subversion of democracy. Isn't it true that the real subversion of democracy is a Prime Minister who has consistently sought to shut Parliament out of this process from the very beginning, who now refuses to go to the people to see if they are still satisfied with a deal that bears no resemblance to the one that was promised them 2.5 years ago? So why will she not go to the people? Why is she so afraid to put her deal to the people? If they still like it, then they will vote for it, but if they don't, they should have the right to remain.
I think when people voted in the referendum in 2016, they wanted to, in the words that were used at the time that I've used since, they wanted control of our borders, of our money and our laws. This deal delivers on that. They wanted us to be able to have an independent trade policy. This deal delivers on that. They wanted us to be out of the CAP and the CFP. This deal delivers on that. And I think we should be delivering what people voted for in 2016.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate my right honourable friend for standing firm on the date? And does she agree with me that, bearing in mind the track record of the EU and the difficulty we've had to negotiate anything like a fair trade deal, the only way we will actually achieve one is when we leave the EU, regain our sovereignty and sit down and discuss properly with them a fair trade deal, which I am convinced personally we will reach, and very quickly.
We have the outline of that trade agreement, of that fair trade, free trade deal with the European Union. We've set that out in the political declaration. We have the opportunity and the commitment to ensure that that can be put in place by December 2020 by agreeing the withdrawal agreement and the package with the political declaration. I believe that's the right thing to do.
Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, Parliament voted in favour of 2 amendments tabled from the backbenchers, from my right honourable friend, the member for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, and also from the right honourable and learned gentleman from Beaconsfield. The support for these amendments, against the wishes of the government, make clear that Parliament does not support leaving the European Union without a deal. The Prime Minister said in her statement just now that no deal would mean no implementation period, no security arrangements in place, no certainty for businesses and workers, and would put the future of Northern Ireland at risk. So given how catastrophic the Prime Minister accepts that a no-deal Brexit would be, will the Prime Minister now rule it out and instead look to extend Article 50 if and when Parliament rejects her deal tomorrow?
It's very simple. Either you have no deal or you have a deal. The deal that is on the table is a good deal for the UK, and the EU has made clear it is the deal.
Helen Grant.
The Minister is working extremely hard and robustly in the best interests of the people of this country. And does she agree with me that our democracy will be damaged if we do not deliver on Brexit?
Well, yes, I do agree with my honourable friend, because I believe that the British people, and many people who voted in the referendum in 2016 hadn't voted before, or hadn't voted for some considerable time. And I think their faith in politics, and indeed the faith of all those who voted to leave the EU in politics, would be damaged if we don't deliver on that. And I think it's very simple. We asked the people what their view was. We said we would do what they decided, and we should now do it.
Tom Brake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was the Prime Minister's absolute conviction in 2017 that it wasn't in the country's interest to hold a general election. It is now the Prime Minister's absolute conviction that we will secure a legal deal setting out our future relationship with the EU by December 2022 at the latest, albeit 6.5 years after the Brexit vote. Why should we believe the Prime Minister?
The commitment to that and the determination to reach that point isn't simply something that I've said. It is there in the documents. It's a commitment from the UK government and the European Union.
Johnny Elphick.
Will the Prime Minister confirm that whatever tactics used by the party opposite, whatever Trump-style shutdown threats of government finances that they may bring to this House, that she is determined that we should leave the European Union on the 29th of March? And does she also agree that while no deal wouldn't be ideal, it wouldn't be the end of the world either?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, as I said earlier today, of course, there would be damage to the economy. There would be an impact. There would be consequences of no deal, and I've set those out. Now, over time, the UK could recover from that. But I believe what is important, as my honourable friend says, is that we do deliver that leaving the European Union. And I am concerned about attempts that could be made to try and find ways of effectively rejecting the vote that the British people took in 2016. I believe we should deliver Brexit, and this government will do so.
Peter Kyle.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has said that she listened to the previous debate and withdrew the vote so that she could focus on the backstop. But the truth is that concerns about trade and Dover were raised 3 times more than the backstop. What negotiations has she had with the EU about trade and the border in Dover in the last few weeks, and what changes has she brought back to the House?
What the political declaration sets out is an ambitious trade arrangement with the European Union for the future. It sets out very clearly a number of specifics in relation to the customs arrangements across the border between the United Kingdom and the European Union, at the various points in which that border is. And of course, what we now see is a clear commitment from the European Union to the nature of that political declaration and the fact that it is part of the package with the withdrawal agreement.
Rachel McLean.
Will the Prime Minister provide assurances to the distribution, the exporting, the technological and the manufacturing businesses in my Redditch constituency that if and when, as I hope it will be, this deal is passed, she will move quickly to put in place our future arrangements to give them the certainty that they need, and most importantly, their employees for my constituents?
My honourable friend raises a very important point, that we should consider those businesses, those employers and the constituents who are employed by them. And indeed, I will move quickly. Once, it's clear now from the EU, once the withdrawal agreement has had the agreement of this House, then we can sit down and start that work of putting that future relationship in place such that it is there at the end of the implementation period and there is a smooth and orderly exit for businesses and their employees in this country.
Angela Smith.
Speaker, in May 2012, the government asked the people of Sheffield to vote in a referendum as to whether or not they wanted a city mayor. Sheffield rejected that by 65%, but the government went on to impose a mayoral model 3 years later. Why is it right for the government to ignore the wishes of the people in one referendum, but to also say that they're going to abide by the decision in a referendum in another?
To the Honourable Lady that in 2016, as part of the campaign for the referendum, the government, which had a position that it was supporting Remain in the European Union, sent out a leaflet to every household in the United Kingdom in which it clearly said that it would abide by the decision of the referendum.
David Duquette.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can my honourable friend confirm that, contrary to the assertions made by President Macron and others, that in the undesirable event for both sides of a backstop, there will be no more common access to our waters for EU fishing vessels?
Yes, I can confirm that to my honourable friend. What is clear is that if no agreement has been reached on this matter, then there will be no access to our waters for EU boats in the circumstances in which the backstop is in place. It's one of the reasons why the European Union will not consider it to be a good place for them.
It is what it's true.
Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the Prime Minister's Lancaster House speech, she said that the future agreement with the EU would be concluded by the time the Article 50 process had finished. That was to be used for businesses to implement that deal during the transition period. That's now not the case, is it?
We have very clearly the framework for that future relationship in the political declaration. We have the commitment that we can start that work on that quickly, and we have the implementation period for businesses.
Maggie Through.
Can I thank my rightable friend for her determination to secure a deal that protects jobs across Erewash? Can she also confirm that the EU 27 have committed to work at a rapid pace to get future trade deals in place so we will never need the backstop?
Yes, this is one of the things that we now see confirmed by the European Union, that is indeed their commitment. They want to ensure that we can work together so that we get that future relationship in place at the end of the implementation period, and the backstop need never be used.
Does the Prime Minister recognise that by threatening members of Parliament with a democratic catastrophe if we vote against her job-destroying deal, she is embracing not only the hand of President Trump, but his methods? And would she now say explicitly, and for the benefit in particular of those threatening members of Parliament online and on our streets, that she agrees that for her government to lose tomorrow's vote does not undermine democracy. On the contrary, it shows that no one, and particularly not this failing government, is above our parliamentary sovereignty.
First of all, what I have said would undermine democracy, and I'm clear would undermine democracy, is a failure of this Parliament to deliver on the vote of the British people and to deliver Brexit. But I must say to the Honourable Lady, first of all, can I say to the Honourable Lady that I have absolutely no trust. There should be none of the sort of behaviour that we have seen online or physically in relation to members of this House or other members of the public on their views on the European Union. This is very serious. The way in which that aggressive and vicious attitude has been taken is absolutely wrong. But can I also say to her, this is a deal that protects jobs. What would have a negative impact on jobs is to leave the European Union without a deal.
Richard Graham.
Speaker, much of the concern about the Northern Ireland backstop is to do with trust. So could the Prime Minister confirm my understanding of one of the reassurances she's achieved, which is that even if EU member states haven't ratified a future trade agreement, that trade agreement would still be applied in order to avoid the backstop, meaning that we would not be hostage to any regional parliament like the Walloons or anywhere else that the Canadian agreement was?
My honourable friend is right. It is normal practice in trade agreements to enable them to be brought into place provisionally while ratification processes are being undertaken. And it is, we have been clear that that is what we would do, and the Commission is clear that they would recommend that that is what the European Union should do, such that the trade agreement could be put in place, the backstop wouldn't need to be used, and it would not be hostage to those ratification processes.
Chris Bright.
Downing Street has repeatedly briefed that the Prime Minister is intending to support the amendments tabled by her honourable friends from East Devon and South West Wiltshire tomorrow afternoon. But earlier on in this process, the Government argued very forcefully that any amendment to the motion under the EU Withdrawal Act would mean that it was impossible for the Government to ratify the treaty. So if she's supporting amendments tomorrow, she is arguing that she should not be allowed to ratify the treaty. Surely that can't be right. Surely it's time that she came clean and just decided it's either we vote in favour or we vote against tomorrow.
Can I first of all say to the right honourable gentleman that, of course, nobody yet knows what amendments the Speaker will choose to have for debate and vote tomorrow, for voting tomorrow. But the point about the ratification of the withdrawal agreement bill when that comes, ratification of the treaty as in the withdrawal agreement bill when that comes through, is that that bill needs to obviously to reflect what is in the withdrawal agreement. But a number of issues have been raised by honourable members across this House. The ones that he has referred to, also issues around workers' rights, where we have the ability to give further concrete, confidence to members of this House in a way which does not actually impact on the ratification of the treaty. No, it doesn't.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whatever option people want to see for the future relationship, other than actually remaining in the EU, there will need to be some sort of agreement with the European Union, and that will mean money, citizens' rights and some guarantees around the Northern Ireland border. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that just kicking the can down the road, as some people want to do opposite, isn't going to change any of those issues?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. Any agreement that we have is going to contain those elements, and we have those elements in the deal that is before us, and I think suggestions that all we need to do is somehow just take longer and longer and longer is not right, and I think the British people would turn around and say, 3 years on, we need to leave.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker. In December 2017, in response to a question from myself, Prime Minister, you stated that Northern Ireland would never be treated differently in relation to the single market and the customs union. I welcomed that reply, and today, Prime Minister, you referred to yourself as a proud unionist. However, tomorrow, the 15th of February, the withdrawal agreement has changed that, and Northern Ireland will be treated very differently from the rest of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. This time, the unionism that the Prime Minister has put forward has been weakened? Will the Prime Minister reiterate the unionism of December 2017 and not her watered-down and false version of February 2019?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, as he will have noted, we published a document last week in relation to Northern Ireland, which confirms the commitments we've given on one of the issues that has been of concern and been raised by the honourable gentleman and his honourable and right honourable colleagues in the DUP about the difference in regulation, potential difference in regulation between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And we're clear about the commitment that we would give in relation to that situation, such that we did not see that difference occurring in the circumstances in which the backstop was put in place. I believe firmly in the union of the United Kingdom, and everything I do, I want to do to ensure that we maintain the union of the United Kingdom. There are, of course, some differences in treatment already for Northern Ireland in relation to some of the laws. Those are of significance in some of the areas in which they operate. But, of course, in the future we have given that commitment to ensure we don't have that divergence.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am very appreciative of the seemingly tireless efforts of the Prime Minister in negotiating the withdrawal agreement. But with regard to the backstop protocol, is it not the case that because we cannot...
Księgi Izajasza. Ożyją Twoi umarli, Twoje ciała wstaną. Obudzą się i będą śpiewać radośnie ci, którzy leżą w prochu, gdyż Twoja rosa jest rosą światłości, a ziemia wyda zmarłych. Kochany Panie Boże, który mieszkasz w niebie, dziękujemy Ci za to, że według słów Twojego Pisma Świętego Ty jesteś zmartwychwstaniem i życiem. Ty jesteś źródłem wszelkiego istnienia. Ty jesteś Panem życia i śmierci. I dlatego zwracamy się do Ciebie z ufnością, Panie, dzisiaj, prosząc o to, abyś pocieszył w bólu zbolałe serca, które dzisiaj przyszły na to miejsce, aby powspominać człowieka, który tak wiele zrobił dla tego miasta, naszego prezydenta Pawła Adamowicza. Daj, Panie, aby w naszych sercach, w naszej pamięci pozostało tylko to, co dobre. I abyśmy, Panie, wspominając go, mogli pamiętać, jak wiele serca włożył w to, żeby to miasto było takie, jakie jest. Prosimy Ciebie, Panie, abyś miał w opiece jego rodzinę, wszystkich współpracowników, abyś pocieszył ich, Panie, abyś zabrał strach, abyś zabrał ból. A przede wszystkim, Panie, abyś pomógł, aby w naszym mieście mogła panować Twoja święta atmosfera, tak aby nie było już więcej takich wydarzeń, to zwiąż, Panie, prosimy wszelkie moce ciemności, które posługują się takimi ludźmi, jak ten nieszczęsny człowiek. I spraw, Panie, abyśmy się nawzajem miłowali. O to prosimy Ciebie w imieniu Jezusa. Amen.
Bardzo dziękuję za tą ekumeniczną modlitwę. Dziękuję także w imieniu najbliższych Pana Prezydenta, jego żony, dwóch córek Antoniny i Tereski, brata Piotra i wszystkich bliskich za słowa otuchy i solidarności, które od wczoraj do nas docierały. Dzisiaj są tu z nami m.in. prezydent Lech Wałęsa, marszałek Bogdan Borusewicz, pan wojewoda, posłowie, senatorowie, wielu przyjaciół samorządowców. Ale jest także z nami Donald Tusk, którego bardzo proszę o zabranie głosu.
Drogi Pawle, jesteśmy tu dzisiaj z Tobą jako Twoi przyjaciele. Musiałeś czekać tak długo, aż do tak tragicznej chwili, żeby zobaczyć już stamtąd z góry, ilu masz tych przyjaciół tu w Gdańsku. Dziesiątki tysięcy. Przyszliśmy także tu do Ciebie dzisiaj jako Gdańszczanie. Każdy mieszkaniec Gdańska pamięta Ciebie od Twojej najwcześniejszej młodości. Byłeś zawsze tam, gdzie trzeba było pokazać dobrą i odważną twarz i stanąć przeciwko złu. To nie jest banda. Naprawdę całe Twoje życie na tym polegało. Przyszliśmy tutaj dzisiaj do Ciebie wszyscy jako Polacy. Pamiętam, z jakim wzruszeniem śpiewałeś wspólnie z nami tę pieśń Solidarności, modlitwę o wschodzie słońca. I chcę Ci dzisiaj, kochany Paweł, obiecać w imieniu nas wszystkich, Gdańszczan, Polaków i Europejczyków, że dla Ciebie i dla nas wszystkich obronimy nasz Gdańsk, naszą Polskę i naszą Europę przed nienawiścią i pogardą. Przyrzekamy Ci to. Żegnaj.
To jest czas dzielenia się dobrem. I z tym testamentem Pawła Adamowicza w naszych sercach, w naszych głowach rozejdźmy się spokojnie do domu.
Dziękuję Gdańskowi, dziękuję Gdańszczankom i Gdańszczanom za tę piękną, liczną obecność.
Moje obawy, które miałem od wczoraj. Powiedzmy, że spodziewałem się tego, że może to pójść w dobrą i w złą stronę. No. Tylko i wyłącznie pogorszyła mi humor.
Czy w takich chwilach powinniśmy właśnie być razem, łączyć się w tym bólu?
Tak, tym bardziej, bo ja na przykład jestem z okolic Gdańska, więc mnie to też dosyć mocno dotknęło, bo też wiem, jakby jak ludzie mówili o tym człowieku, więc jakby ja zdaję sobie sprawę, że my nie wybieramy w tym momencie człowieka, tylko partię, ale to w tym momencie nie powinno mieć żadnego znaczenia. Powinniśmy się łączyć w takich chwilach i to jest chyba w tym momencie najważniejsze.
Zniczek ku pamięci prezydentowi?
Tak, oczywiście.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Naked light I saw 10,000 people, maybe more. People talking without speaking. People hearing without listening. People writing songs that voices never share. And no one dared disturb the sound of silence. Oh, said I am too long. Przesuńcie się w prawo.
Dobra, jest. Przechodzimy dalej.
Gdzie dalej? Nie, my nie. Słuchajcie, wszyscy z końca przechodzimy, proszę tutaj dalej.
Proszę Państwa, marsz dopiero schodzi z ulicy Marszałkowskiej, także nas tu będzie troszeczkę. Prosimy przesuwać się w lewą stronę, tak? Ktoś już przyszedł, żebyśmy się wszyscy zmieścili mniej więcej tutaj na tym placu do Wiktorii.
Tutaj zróbmy troszkę więcej miejsca, bo tu właściwie się zaraz
za Twoim przewodem złączym się z narodem. Marsz, marsz Dąbrowski, z ziemi włoskiej do Polski, za Twoim przewodem złączym się z narodem. Przejdzie Wisłę, przejdzie Wartę, będzie Polakami. Dał nam przykład Bonaparte, jak zwyciężać mamy. Marsz, marsz Dąbrowski, z ziemi włoskiej do Polski, za Twoim przewodem złączym się z narodem. Marsz, marsz Dąbrowski, z ziemi włoskiej do Polski, za Twoim przewodem.
Marsz, marsz Dąbrowski, z ziemi włoskiej do Polski, za Twoim przewodem